Good evening. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program. Please stay tuned to the end of today's program for a brief update on our upcoming programs. Also, if many of you are not members yet, there are great benefits for becoming a member of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Please go to our website at lawacth.org and find out what you're missing and all the great programs and benefits you can be participating in. For those of you who would like to ask questions of Dan, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 30 or 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to bring on screen Dan Schnur, our own professor of politics, and his weekly program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
It's crazy busy. We're starting to make plans to bring in-person back, and we've got a great live stream program lineup, and we've got you at your new time slot at 5 o'clock. So things are cooking.
Well, like everybody else, I'm very, very excited for in-person programming when it is able to happen. But in the meantime, I'm really glad we're able to have these conversations too.
This is a staple. We love it. Dan, let's get to you have two great topics today. Number one, from Haiti to Texas to Washington, where the immigration debate stands. And secondly, why police reform isn't happening. I know we've got a lot to cover, so let me turn it over to you. Thank you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Kim. And thanks to all of you for being with us for this week's conversation. We do have two very important conversations, two very important topics that we're going to cover proactively today. But of course, as all of you know, at the bottom of the hour when Jessica joins me, we'll expand the conversation, not just to include a lot more of your questions and thoughts and perspectives, but to any of the other topics that we don't get to in the first 30 minutes that of course we'll want to talk about before we conclude for the day. Now, as you know, for those of you who've watched in the past, you know that Kim and I, as we're getting started with the program each week, we often joke about how there's just so much news deserving all of our attention each week that not all of it always receives the attention it deserves. And some issues, even issues of critical import, because they drag on for weeks and months of negotiations, even smart, concerned people like all of you, we find that we're not watching those discussions as closely as we should. And we'll be talking about two of those issues today. A little later, we'll talk about the end of efforts in Congress, for now anyway, to implement police reform. And a year and a half ago, after the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, this topic dominated our conversations. Well, a year and a half later, not so much, but more on that later. Because first, let's examine another issue that it seems like we've been watching forever: the challenge of overseeing migration into this country. Now, we talked about this last winter when there was a surge of migrants at the border early in the Biden administration. We talked about it in the spring, as some of you remember, when Kamala Harris went to Guatemala and Mexico to discuss root causes of immigration with those countries' leaders. Otherwise, I'm afraid to say, this immense policy challenge and human tragedy often turns into almost background noise to other crises of the day, the week, of the month in Washington and elsewhere that tend to captivate our attention because they're so urgent and they're so immediate. And so a conversation like immigration, because it's so omnipresent, as important as a topic as it is one that just sort of is a continual point of discussion. We're not always paying as much attention to it as we should. But that all changed last week. Now, that changed less because of a change in the substantive policy debate, but for another real world reason. Now, many of you may remember several years ago when the tragic photo of the young Syrian child who'd washed up on the shores of Greece captivated world attention and, albeit briefly, led to renewed international interest in engagement on that refugee crisis that up until then had largely drifted out of our minds. And it was that very stark visual image that grabbed our attention and forced us to confront a crisis that had seemed too big, too complicated, and too remote for us to stay focused on. And so just over a week ago, the same thing happened in this hemisphere, when photos and videos of US Border Patrol agents confronting Haitian refugees at the US-Mexico border began to appear. And those images forced us to think about how this country deals with such large numbers of arrivals from other places in the world. But before we go any further, I would like, Claire, if you can join me, I would like to ask all of you what you think the Biden administration should have been doing to handle that Haitian refugee crisis. Should the administration, number one, have allowed all Haitian refugees to stay in the United States? Number two, should they have been more precise and allowed only children and families to stay and sending single adults, particularly single males, away, not letting them into the US? Third, should those refugees be required to wait in Mexico until the opportunity arose for them to come into the United States in a more orderly fashion? Or fourth, should the US government have transported those refugees back to Haiti, to their country of origin? Now, obviously, a solution is going to be multifaceted and would and did encompass all four of these approaches. But which do you think is the most appropriate and the most important one? Well, look at that. Really interesting. 44% of our group said that we should require those refugees to wait in Mexico until coming to the United States. Now, that's what the Biden administration did with some of those refugees, and they were criticized fiercely for continuing a policy that had been developed and implemented during the Trump administration. And many critics of Biden, particularly from the left, said, wait a minute, this is just what Trump did with his wait in Mexico policy. We thought you were going to be something better. And I think what this group has recognized is there aren't any easy answers on a challenge of this magnitude. 25% we should allow all of those refugees to stay in the United States. And while that creates certain logistical concerns, and while it would have created almost certainly some significant political challenges for the Biden administration, a full quarter of us said no, they should all be allowed to stay. 17% that only children and families should stay. So there wasn't that much differentiation here, and that's much more of a distinction that the Biden administration did make. And 13% sent those refugees back to Haiti, perhaps knowing that many of those who came across the US-Mexico border last week had actually left Haiti many, many years ago, emigrated to Central and South America, and only recently made their way northward into this country. So when they were returned to Haiti, they were returned to a country that frankly they didn't know very well because they had left such a long time ago. Anyway, no easy answers here. The Biden administration, as I said, implemented a combination of these four policies, leaving almost absolutely no one happy with the results. As I said earlier, critics from the left, very angry at the Biden administration for what they felt was a continuation of the Trump administration policy, and critics from the right, saying that Biden was not properly prepared to handle this influx at the border, and that border enforcement is, they argue, an essential part of any kind of immigration policy reform. End result is not just because of this, it's been a trend that's been developing over the months. Joe Biden's poll numbers, specifically on the question of immigration, are very decidedly in the negative and have been one of the contributing factors in bringing down his overall approval ratings with the American people. So like I said, no easy answers here, but at least right now, the American people not all that happy with the way they believe that this president is handling this challenge and this crisis. Now, to be fair to Biden and to be fair to his predecessors, the nature of this challenge at the border has changed dramatically in recent years because a much, much broader mix of nationalities is turning up at the US-Mexico border than in the past. For decades, as most of you know, most of the crossers were Mexican men, single men crossing for potential employment. But in recent years, instead of men coming across from Mexico, we've seen more and more families coming from the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And we talked about that in more detail earlier this year when Vice President Harris visited the region. But now we're seeing large numbers of Ecuadorians, Brazilians, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, Cubans, and of course Haitians turning up by the hundreds of thousands. And that's a trend that has accelerated very sharply, very dramatically just in the last 6 months. Let me give you some numbers to back this up. From October of last year until this August, so October of 2020 until this August, 10 months, nearly 300,000 migrants from countries other than Mexico in the Northern Triangle were encountered at the border. 300,000 migrants from countries other than Mexico in those 3 Central American countries. That's almost a quarter of all the crossings. If you broaden this out a little bit for fiscal 2020, when the pandemic, fiscal year 2020, when the pandemic was slowing the migrant flow, the figure was nearly 44,000, or 11% of crossings. Back in 2018, it was 5%. Back in 2008, just 1% of the migrants at the US-Mexico border came from countries other than Mexico and the Northern Triangle. Now, the fastest growing groups are Haitians. From October of last year through the end of August, about 28,000 Haitians were arrested trying to catch the US-Mexico border. That's 6 times the 4,400 Haitians that were arrested during the entire 2020 fiscal year that ended last September. And as we saw recently, that one outpost, that one shelter that emerged just over the US-Mexico border that we saw in the news, that one shelter expanded from a few dozen people to more than 10,000 in roughly a week. And now, because of the deportations back to Haiti, because of forcing other migrants back to Mexico, and by welcoming several thousand Haitian families in the United States, that shelter that was once more than 10,000 people, less than just over a week ago, is now pretty much empty. So in July and August, migrants from other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean as a group outpaced those from Mexico or individual countries from the Northern Triangle for the first time. That means fewer migrants from Mexico and the 3 Central American countries than the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean. Now more than 9 in 10 migrants from other countries come from just 6 Latin American nations. I mentioned this earlier: Ecuador, Brazil, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Haiti. So it's a much more complicated challenge. If an individual man comes to this country from Mexico, then the logistics, if you decide that he should not be allowed to stay in the country, are much easier. Even the families coming from Central America were a relatively straightforward path. But given this huge influx from the rest of the Western Hemisphere, this isn't just a much bigger challenge in terms of the size of the migrant flow. It's a much bigger challenge in terms of scope and scale. Because if you decide that you're not going to allow some portion of these migrants to stay in the country, the process of returning them gets much, much more difficult. Now, what that means is that encounters of migrants at the border are at roughly a 20-year high. Border apprehensions are expected to reach about 1.7 million this year. 1.7 million migrant apprehensions at the border this year. That's roughly twice the number from 2019 before COVID. And of course, we have no way of knowing how many cross undetected. Now, at the same time, meanwhile, moving this conversation from the border up to Washington, Meanwhile, just last week, the Senate parliamentarian, the individual who makes the decisions about what can be included in various pieces of legislation and what can't be. Well, in the middle of all this, the Senate parliamentarian ruled last week that Democrats' effort to legalize millions of undocumented immigrants through the so-called reconciliation package, the $3.5 trillion legislation that is primarily set up for climate change and social spending and tax increases. Originally, Democrats had wanted to include immigration reform in this reconciliation package and pass it on a straight party line vote. But the parliamentarian, Elizabeth McDonough, who is nonpartisan, she said that they could not include immigration in the budget bill after hearing arguments from both sides, saying that it wasn't relevant directly to the fiscal matters the reconciliation bill is supposed to be addressing. So on one hand, you've got this growing crisis at the border. On the other hand, you've got a diminishing set of options in Washington, D.C. for dealing with the broader crisis. And so what that leaves the Democrats with is no obvious path forward. Several Democrats have said they're going to try to change the immigration reform so it can be included in reconciliation. Senator Dick Durbin, the number 2 senator in the Democratic caucus, is continuing his work with a small number of Republican senators. They're still trying to fashion bipartisan legislation that would allow dreamers and farm workers and other small groups to come into this country. But right now, there's nothing obvious on the horizon. And just for perspective, it's worth noting that the last time the United States accomplished major immigration reform was in 1986, when the Simpson-Mazzoli Act was signed by President Ronald Reagan. So question for all of you before we go on to our second topic. What do you think are the prospects of immigration reform passing this year, either as part of the reconciliation package that Biden is going to be putting before Congress in the weeks ahead, or as part of a standalone package that Senator Durbin and the Republicans are working on? What do you think? One, are you optimistic? Do you think even given all these obstacles, maybe they can still pass a major reform? Second, you say, well, maybe more limited reform. They'll pass something, but it is going to be a little bit more narrow. Third, no, next year is probably a much better bet. And fourth, even more pessimistic, no, they're not going to pass immigration reform, and they're not going to do it for the foreseeable future. So what does our group think, Claire? Well, not a particularly optimistic group. And I have to admit, I probably put my thumb on the scale with my lead in to that, which I'll concede might have not been entirely fair. But 42%, a little bit less than half, say not only no immigration reform this year or next year, but not for the foreseeable future. 55% are somewhat more optimistic, saying either next year it might get done or a more limited type of reform will happen this year. And 3% of you are still pretty optimistic, presumably saying, given the scope of the real world crisis, this is something that Congress can come together on. And so we'll see going forward. But before we do, let's talk about another issue where the two sides weren't able to come together. Let's talk about police reform and what happened, not only to the legislation, but to the public debate over police reform and public safety changes, and how the nature of that debate changed since last summer to the fall of 2021. Because it seems like it wasn't much more than a year ago when the debate over public safety and police reform was dominating the national political conversation. It was after the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and then the summer of protests and very highly charged conversations over race relations around the country that followed. It looked for a while like these issues might actually determine the outcome of the presidential election. This is when the defund the police debate got started. You had a very small number of Democrats who actually wanted to either shut down police departments or take away large portions of their funding. Republicans said, look, the Democrats wanted to defund the police and want to leave you defenseless. Joe Biden said, I don't want to defund the police. Got some progressives in his own party angry with him, but successfully protected himself from those kind of charges from his opponents. and obviously was elected president. But down ticket, it's speculated that this argument might have actually cost the Democrats further potential pickups in House and Senate races. So all last summer, all last fall, this is something that was talked about constantly. And right in the middle of all that, you had a group of top congressional leaders from both parties promising legislative action on police reform, on public safety, on criminal justice reform. And so at the beginning of this year, you had a group of high-level congressional negotiators, including Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, the Democrat, and Tim Scott, the Republican senator from South Carolina, working with Karen Bass, the Democrat from Los Angeles in the House of Representatives. And they began working toward in an effort to find common ground on these issues between the two parties. And for much of this year, for much of the spring and early summer, it looked like they were making pretty good progress. Senator Booker and Senator Scott in particular devoted themselves to finding common ground that would overhaul law enforcement and examine law and police tactics and accountability, and try to improve both public safety and the relationship between police officers and the communities they serve. And over the course of the months, we learned that they achieved compromises on a wide range of topics, including how to reform police recruitment and training, on the availability of military equipment being sold to local police departments, on federal standards for apprehension tactics and forced entry circumstances for the police. And extremely important, they found common ground on increased transparency of police conduct in charges of alleged transgressions so that information could be available to the public. So they made an immense amount of progress. And Senators Booker and Scott really deserve a lot of credit for resisting the strongest voices from the extremes of their own parties who didn't want to see a deal. And had the bill passed, it would have reflected, in my opinion, immense steps forward on most important policy challenges in this area. But the biggest obstacle from the beginning was on the question of what's called qualified immunity. And qualified immunity is what examines the question of whether police officers should be legally liable for the use of excessive force against suspects and other potential constitutional violations that they commit while in the process of apprehending a suspected criminal. Now, what Senator Scott, the Republican, proposed was a compromise that would have exposed police departments to those types of lawsuits rather than individual officers. And what Senator Scott said, and some of you may remember, he came and spoke with us about this on a webinar last summer. Senator Scott's reasoning was that the possibility of legal exposure to the police departments would incentivize those departments to change their culture and to work harder to make it clear to their officers what types of behavior would not be acceptable and what would be acceptable. He said, you sue an individual police officer, that policeman or policewoman doesn't have a lot of financial resources, they get weeded out, but it doesn't do anything to change the overall culture of a department. You make the police department itself legally liable, and not only do you have a lot more money at their disposal because they're a government entity, but they're in a position to make broader cultural changes within the department. Now, the counter to that historically has been that an individual police officer who commits this kind of inappropriate act should be held accountable. So it looked for a while like the Senator Scott and Booker might come to a bipartisan agreement. It didn't happen. But before we go any further, actually, let me ask you what you think about this issue. Claire, can we go to our next question? Which opinion is closest to your own on this question of qualified immunity? Should individual police officers be able to be sued for their actions? Number one. Number two, should police departments be legally liable, but not necessarily individual officers? Or third, would you argue that police should have immunity from most prosecution because making them legally liable like that makes them more hesitant to do the jobs that we've hired them to do to protect our communities? So of those three options, which opinion do you think? Which opinion is closest to your own? Very interesting. 57% agree with Senator Scott, and to be fair, Senator Booker, that police departments rather than officers ought to be sued. 39%, well, more than a third, say no, individual officers should be liable for lawsuits too. And only 4% would give police complete and total immunity. So anyway, when they began to work out the details on this, time passed because this is fairly intricate policy stuff. And as time passes, public opinion shifts. And when public opinion shifts, momentum slows, and so does urgency for an agreement. And that's exactly what happened. Because as George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's deaths moved out of the headlines, the bases of both political parties began to reassert their objections to any agreement that would not give them everything they wanted. And that loss of momentum turned fatal. And after several months of asserting the possibility of a bill still existed, just last week, Senator Tim Scott and Senator Cory Booker just said, we're done. We weren't able to do it. We tried as hard as we could. So question for the group. I've given you my opinion on what I think kept criminal justice reform from passing, even given all those areas where there was agreement. What do you think? Option number one, that should read the substantive differences between the two parties was too large, was too great. The difference was just too big. Option number two, too much time had passed since George Floyd's death. Third, the defund the police argument undermined the Democrats' position on the bill, like it might have in some House races last year. Fourth, Republicans didn't want a deal because they want to run on the issue again next year, like they did in House and Senate races last year. Or five, Democrats want to run on this issue next year because they know it's one that they can use to motivate their party's base in midterm elections when a base isn't always that motivated on behalf of the president's party. So it probably, almost certainly is more than one of these options. But let's see which one all of you said was most important. Well, now that is the closest thing to a split decision we've seen in a while here. 33% of you, a third, say that the defund the police argument not only may have harmed Democrats in last year's elections, but it undermined their bargaining position on this bill. 32% of you, almost exactly the same number, say, look, the substantive differences were just too big, they weren't going to get there. 19% say it's the Republicans who want to run on the issue versus only 3% who say that the Democrats want to run on it. And 13% say, as I did, that when too much time passes after the event that crystallizes public attention, it gets harder to maintain and the momentum begins to slow. So a very split decision on that one, no question about it. But to me, one curious aspect of the death of this legislation is how many areas of agreement were left on the table. As I mentioned earlier, they had come to a compromise on so many topics: chokeholds, enforced entry regulations, training and transparency requirements, and many other aspects of criminal justice reform that could have easily been the core of a slimmed down bill that just didn't address the qualified immunity question. But my own opinion, my own guess, is that on a congressional landscape that's become so polarized and so partisan on so many other issues, even areas where potential for bipartisan agreement actually existed became casualties of anger and finger pointing. In my mind, it's one thing for legislation to collapse when the differences between the two parties are too vast, are just too big to overcome, and roughly a third of you agreed with that point. But the most disappointing thing about this issue to me is I didn't feel like the gap was nearly as large as we've seen on immigration and voting rights and any number of other issues. They seem like they're pretty close to getting there. And so what I take away from this is even when you find a small number of members of Congress who still want to go work across party lines, there's a lot more who don't. And the key challenge going forward on issues like immigration and voting rights and so many other issues where bipartisan agreement is necessary is not just to find a small number of members on both sides who want to cross party lines, but to expand those numbers And I think while Senator Scott and Senator Booker deserve immense credit for the work they did to negotiate toward common ground between the two of them, by not including more of their members on both sides as part of the process, they both found themselves all too isolated and realized when the time came to make that final agreement, neither one of them had sufficient support from the bases of their own parties. Anyway, plenty of other things to talk about. And my guess is that among all the other things that we haven't touched on today, at least some of you are going to want to talk about the pending government shutdown that may take place in a few days. And of course, we'll talk about that during your questions and at much greater length next week when we talk about how the budget bill, the debt limit, and the president's infrastructure legislation and reconciliation bill all intertwine together into one almost incomprehensible Washington mess. But we'll do our best next week to untangle it. And of course, if any of you have questions about it over the next 30 minutes, I'll do my best to answer them before we get into that topic in more detail next Tuesday. So Jessica, I'm ready when you are. If let's broaden out this conversation. What do you say?
Sounds good. Before we launch into the Q&A session, I would like to thank our members and viewers for your continued support. We depend upon your donations and memberships to cover our expenses so that we can continue to bring you these important discussions. So if you're able to make a donation, please go to our website at lawacth.org and click on that donate button or become a member. We greatly appreciate it. A lot of questions on the immigration topic, so that will probably be a big portion of our Q&A. First question, Mayorkas told Chris Wallace this weekend that they released 12,000 Haitians into the US, and Washington Post has previously reported that 44% of refugees released into our country never return for their court date. How does this administration and Mayorkas in particular plan to protect our borders and manage immigration when they seem so keen to not enforce laws on the books?
Well, and of course, this is the criticism that the Biden administration has faced since his taking office. And it's not that different a conversation than we were having last February. The conflict within the Biden administration and within most administrations is on one hand between the need to enforce our borders and on the other hand, to recognize genuine humanitarian need when it's appropriate. It is important to remember that in the case of most of these Haitian refugees, not all of them, but the overwhelming majority, that they are not here as economic migrants. And according to US law, someone who comes here solely for economic purposes is supposed to be returned to their country of origin. Most of the Haitian refugees, though, are here seeking asylum. And they're seeking asylum from all the political unrest that's taken place in Haiti. And they're also here as refugees from the extraordinary number of natural disasters that have hit that country over the last several years. Earlier this year, Congress acted to extend the window that allowed Haitian refugees who had fled to the US during the earthquake of 2011 to stay for a longer period of time than the original temporary status that had been granted to them. Many of the Haitians who've shown up at the border in recent weeks had also left Haiti after the earthquake many years ago, had gone to South or Central America, many to Chile, to Bolivia, to Peru, and come to the US more recently. Their thought was, and many would agree, that even though the crisis that drove them out of Haiti was several years ago, they still deserve the benefit of that refugee status. And so between those seeking political asylum and those seeking refugee status that has been granted to others who've left their country as a result of the earthquake and other natural disasters, they feel they have that it's appropriate for them to stay here. The counter argument, of course, is that this country does have laws about people who illegally migrate here from other countries in other parts of the world. In the immediate, I don't think the Biden administration tried to resolve that broader question about political asylum versus political asylum seekers versus those seeking economic opportunities. What they did instead is they tried to deal with the crisis on the ground. So instead of having more than 10,000 people for all practical purposes living under a bridge, they split the difference, granted asylum to many of those Haitians, primarily to children and to parents with children, returned some of those refugees directly to Haiti, even if they hadn't lived here in many years, and told others that they needed to remain in Mexico. So think of that less as a policy decision on the Biden administration's part and more of an effort to deal with the real world, a real-time emergency by taking advantage of every possible option to alleviate the suffering they saw developing there. You may disagree on whether it was right or wrong, but I think it is important to distinguish between a more formalized policy decision and an effort to deal with this type of urgent situation.
We had two questions here that are similar, so I'm going to combine them. One was asking, Haiti is an island. They didn't swim. It is unlikely that they could afford to fly. How are they organized to arrive in Del Rio at one moment? And then another questioner was also asking if there was any push from Russia or Chinese troll factories encouraging on social media that the Haitians try to come to the border now.
Well, there's no question that there was communication between these refugees, not just those who left Haiti here somewhat recently, but those who have settled in Central and South America over the years. And one of the criticisms the Biden administration has received is what some feel have been inconsistent messaging from the president and the administration on whether migrants are welcome here and which ones are. And so it appeared that for much of this Haitian expat community that was already living in Latin America, word spread very quickly, almost virally, whether through cell phones, whether through Facebook, whatever it happened to be, saying, now that there's been a change of administrations in the US, Biden is not being as hardline on this as Trump was. Now is our opportunity. Whether it was instigated by bad actors, China or Russia or others, I have no idea. But it is very clear that electronic digital communications, cell phones, texting, and so on, did allow word to spread remarkably rapidly through that expatriate community, encourage large numbers of Haitians to leave the countries in which they'd settled and move northward. So it wasn't a coincidence, but whether it was a self-generated effort or one influenced by outside forces is one that I'm afraid I don't know the answer.
The photographer of the Border Patrol interaction with the Haitians said that he didn't see the reins being used as whips against those in Del Rio, but the media ran with that to the point that the White House has changed its enforcement and they can no longer use horses. If they don't want horses or enforcement, would something that follows the non-aggression principle, like say a wall, be something Democrats would support?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on here with that photo. Even though the Border Patrol agent on horseback who was photographed attempting to apprehend the refugee, even though the photographer, the witness, said that that individual was not using the reins as a whip, there have been eyewitness accounts that some border agents have done just that. Now, many of the border agents say that it's extremely difficult to differentiate between migrants and smugglers, and that sometimes in the heat of the moment, they make erroneous judgments about an individual and what his or her intentions or role in the process might be. But the Biden administration was clearly sensitive to criticisms from immigration reform advocates. And so they weighed in very, very heavily, ironically enough, against their own government policy. It had been the policy, obviously, of the Border Patrol not to use the reins as whips, but to use horseback to chase and presumably to apprehend these migrants. What the White House has now said, what the Department of Homeland Security has now said, is we do want you to apprehend migrants who are coming across without authorization, but we're going to put more specific restrictions on what you can do to apprehend them. So in essence, the White House is saying, we do want to maintain border security, but we want to do it in a more humane way. And as I said earlier, what that's done is it's led to increased criticisms from immigration reform advocates who believe that efforts to apprehend these migrants even in a less harsh manner, is still inappropriate and they should be allowed to stay, as a significant portion of our group said, but also at the same time is leading to increased criticism from opponents of broader immigration reform who are saying, as the questioner did, wait a minute, aren't you supposed to reinforce, aren't you supposed to protect the border? The end result is, as I said earlier, that Biden's poll numbers overall are down significantly. To a large part, that's because of the way the voters have judged his handling of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The polls also demonstrate that voters are becoming less and less patient with the president as it relates to handling the pandemic. But there's no question that Biden has lost support, both from his left and his right, with voters on both sides feeling that he's either been too strict or not strict enough in confronting the border crisis. Politically, at least in the short term, it is a no-win situation. We'll see at what point the administration forwards another longer-term potential solution that has the potential to pass.
How do you or we reconcile the Haitians coming as a human rights issue as the Democrats state, or a national security and massive health crisis as the Republicans state?
Well, what President Biden and his advisors would tell you, if they're being completely honest with you, is that those 2 points of view simply are not reconcilable. Though immigration law in this country, as a questioner raised earlier, and as I attempted to address, says many things, but 2 in particular that are relevant here. And it speaks very specific, both of these points speak very directly to the motivation that brings a migrant to the US. If that individual or family comes here because of fear of political persecution, they can apply for asylum. And legally, at least until the pandemic, when the Trump administration instituted some border control rules for COVID-related purposes, that if someone is coming here seeking asylum, we are to allow them to stay while their claim for asylum is investigated. If they're coming here for economic rather than reasons having to do with political persecution, they're supposed to be returned either across the border or their country of origin. What many in the Border Patrol and their supporters say is it's impossible to ascertain that distinction in real time at the border. And so one of the things the Biden administration is doing, I think wisely, that's not getting nearly enough attention, is they're dramatically increasing the presence of individuals at or near the border who can adjudicate asylum claims in real time, rather than releasing an individual or family into this country to come back for a court hearing at some later date. But at least right now, as long as the nation's immigration policy is set up to treat those escaping political persecution one way and economic deprivation another way, there's never going to be a clean set of answers to this. And without a more fundamental and broader readdressing of the policy, it's difficult to see how Biden's favorable ratings, at least on this particular issue, improve to much of a degree.
Why were the Democrats so against the Cubans that were trying to get to the US a few months ago compared to how they're responding to Haitians?
Well, unless I'm missing something, most Republicans, not all, but most Republicans have been very outspoken that neither Cuban or Haitian refugees should be allowed to stay here. Where we have seen an exception, though, is on the question of Afghani refugees. And the Republicans who do support the resettlement of large numbers of Afghanis in this country do say it's because of a result of fear of political persecution from the Taliban. But again, not all Republicans, but the very, very large majority have very strongly opposed both Cuban and Haitian refugee resettlement.
Oh, sorry, they were asking about Democrats not wanting Cubans to come here, not the.
Oh, I completely misunderstood. You should have cut me off earlier, Jessica.
That's okay. That's okay.
Well, I think the Democrats would argue that allowing more Cubans to stay here would have the potential to improve relationships between the two countries. And longer conversation than we have time for today is the tremendous partisan divide over what US-Cuba relations ought to be like. And so putting aside the question of migration for just a moment, most, not all Democrats, but most Democrats believe that the embargo of Cuba over the last 60 years now has not only been ineffective, but has been counterproductive. And that the US should, as Barack Obama began to work to normalize those relationships, that relationship. Most Republicans, not all Republicans, but most Republicans, on the other hand, say just the opposite, that this is a government that is very harsh in its treatment of people, that this is a government that's been a bad actor and supported untoward causes in other parts of the hemisphere for many years, and that we should not try to improve our relations with Cuba. One of the main reasons that Cuban Americans represent one of the exceptions to the overall levels of support that Latino voters provide for Democratic candidates. In the state of Florida primarily, but elsewhere as well, Cuban Americans historically have tended to vote more Republican because of their suspicions of the Castro regime having fled. When it comes to immigration policy, the conversation gets even more complicated. But to get back to what I now understand the question is, I believe that the differences of opinion between Democrats on these two issues has more to do with overall relationships between the US and Cuba than with specifics on immigration policy.
And since you brought up Afghanistan, this questioner says, with the US commitment to the Afghan influx of immigrants based on their service to the war in Afghanistan, what influence does it have on the immigration conversation? Does it fulfill all immigration numbers for this year and next year?
Well, one outcome, both of the Afghanistan withdrawal and the Haitian refugee border crisis, that the Biden administration announced last week that they are dramatically increasing the number of refugees who will be allowed into this country in the next year, beginning on October 1st. As many of you know, over the course of the Trump administration, the number of refugees legally allowed to come to this country and stay had been shrunk very significantly. Biden originally, after taking office, had indicated that he was not going to increase those refugee levels very much. He was met with withering criticism from the base of his own party and moved to increase those numbers to some degree. But in the last week or two, the Biden administration has decided, not solely because of the Afghanistan and Haiti situations, but largely because that they are going to increase those numbers up to well above where they were when Trump took office. So I don't believe, to answer the question, that the additional number of Afghani refugees is going to preclude others from coming to the country in the upcoming year, because the overall cap is now much larger.
We had a couple of people asking about the other countries, or many of the Haitians have been for several years. Why aren't they stepping up, or why can't those Latin American countries step up to help these Haitians as well?
Well, so many of these countries were, to some degree or other, able to help the Haitian refugees. And again, Chile and Peru in particular, although there are others in South America that have taken in immense numbers of refugees from Haiti over the last decade. But as we all know, over the last year and a half, the effect of the coronavirus throughout the world, but particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, has had devastating effects on society and on many countries' economies. And so Haitian refugees who had been able to eke out even a somewhat comfortable existence in Central or South America were now facing increasingly desperate situations because of COVID. And the governments of those countries, which had allowed them to stay, were now being squeezed more and more because of the economic and societal pressures of COVID. So it wasn't completely as a result of the pandemic. As I said, there's at least one school of thought that believes that the inauguration of Joe Biden to replace Donald Trump as president spread through the network and gave many the idea that the US would be more receptive to foreign migrants. And of course, that was a perception that was largely fed by public comments that Biden himself made during the campaign and after taking office. So the changeover in administrations in the US is part of it, but largely it was the coronavirus pandemic that changed what wasn't an ideal situation. It made it even more untenable and began to force these migrants to move northward.
Can you explain why the border issue has not been resolved? Is it too juicy of a campaign issue to ever address?
I think that's part of it. Unfortunately, I think some of the most virulent voices in both parties know that they can motivate their respective bases on the issue. Now, no question about it, Republicans have been much more reluctant to move in a meaningful way on immigration reform in recent years than the Democrats. For many years, many Democrats, including Senator Barack Obama, followed the lead of organized labor, which tended to be much more reluctant to support increased immigration reform because of what they saw as a competition at the entry levels of the employment pool. During President Bush's administration, this began to shift as more and more Republicans began to become increasingly reluctant to support broader immigration reform. You may remember a former congressman from Virginia, a Republican by the name of Eric Cantor, who had risen to be number 2 in the House leadership, the position that Steny Hoyer now holds. He was number 2, he's the House Majority Leader, right behind Paul Ryan, who at that point was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Cantor was one of the Republicans' strongest proponents for immigration reform. And if you remember, immigration reform, comprehensive including a pathway to citizenship for many, many individuals in the country illegally, had passed through the US Senate with not a majority of Republican support, but a decent number of Republicans to get to the to get past the 60 votes level. Eric Cantor lost his primary campaign in rural Virginia to a much more conservative opponent who had attacked Cantor for supporting this immigration reform package. When Republicans saw that one of their party's leaders had lost in a primary because of the issue, they retreated from it fairly quickly. Over the years, different factions within the party have tried to move Republicans on this issue. After Mitt Romney was defeated in 2012, the Republican National Committee set up a commission to examine the reasons for the loss. And one of the main recommendations that this commission made to people who were candidates who were thinking about running for president in 2016 is that they needed to look at immigration reform in a fundamentally different way. Many 2016 candidates did. Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, John Kasich, and others. Donald Trump proved very convincingly that while the Republican Party leadership was willing to move on immigration reform, a large portion of its base was not. And so here we sit now, almost 20 years later, having made little or no progress. One, because Republicans have become so committed to the issue, but also, to be fair, I think there are a number of Republicans who would be willing to move on immigration reform in terms of legalization if Democrats were willing to move on a greater border presence and enhanced border security. I think there is a space somewhere close to the middle where you can strengthen the border and move toward legal status for many undocumented immigrants. But coming back to the premise of the question, when you have the basis of two parties that like having this issue to run on, there's not much incentive for Democrats to give on border-related issues. And there's just as little incentive for Republicans to give on legalization and citizenship issues. So that's something that's, I think, going back to the question we asked the group earlier, Jessica, I think it's going to be quite some time before we see comprehensive reform in this country. And I worry that it's going to take a border crisis much, much greater and much more difficult to address than the one we've just seen over the last few weeks. Long answer,
All
but
right. Yeah, for sure. This questioner says, please explain the history of the debt ceiling, the difference between it and spending and a government shutdown, in addition to the potential danger of not raising the debt ceiling.
Oh my goodness. So this could be
Can we save that for next week?
I went all the way into it. I'll save the longer discussion till next week, because by then I think we'll have a better idea on whether the government actually shut down at midnight on Thursday night or not, rather than just speculating about it. But these are two separate issues that have become intertwined this year. For one, every year, the U.S. Congress has to pass a budget that the governor signs, or excuse me, the president signs. Now, they never do it on time. They haven't done it on time for many, many years. So until they can actually pass a budget for each of the individual cabinet agencies, what Congress does is they pass what's called a continuing resolution that agrees to keep government functioning until the budget is actually passed. Most years, that continuing resolution, and if the continuing resolution is not passed by the deadline, then the government does shut down. Usually, that deadline is met. The rare occasions, remember in 2018, when President Trump and the Democrats in Congress got into a fight about funding on the border wall, we saw a shutdown then. Back in the early 2000s, Senator Ted Cruz led a revolt against President Obama's budget. We saw a shutdown then. Some of you with longer memories may remember way back in the 1990s when Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich couldn't come to agreement on the budget. We saw a shutdown then. So it doesn't happen frequently, but it wouldn't be absolutely unique for the government to shut down for a period of time until this continuing resolution can be passed. The tricky part here is this year, there has become a linkage, and we'll talk more about this next week, between the continuing resolution to keep the government operating until a budget can pass, which most people in both parties agree on. There's more than enough Democratic and Republican votes to pass a continuing resolution, except this year, the Republicans, on a separate piece of legislation, don't want to vote to increase the debt limit. The continuing resolution is a budget that operates the government from year to year. The debt limit was set in statute many, many years ago, requiring Congress to vote whenever the U.S. overall debt surpassed a certain level. Now, there's a separate conversation that maybe we can get into next week about whether the debt limit needs to be increased by Congress or should just happen automatically like it does in most countries. But whether it's a good or bad idea, in order for the U.S. to borrow money to function, the Congress has to formally authorize the raising of the debt limit. This year, Republicans say we're not going to do it. We'll let the Democrats do it all by themselves because they're want to spend all this money in other areas. And for reasons that are too complicated to get into in the next 90 seconds, the continuing resolution to pass a budget to keep the government open and the raising of the debt limit to allow the U.S. to honor its debts have become mixed together. Republicans say we're not going to vote to raise the debt limit. Democrats have to do it by themselves. Democrats know that debt isn't very popular. They want Republicans to vote for it too. So until the two sides can come to some kind of agreement, or at least temporary compromise on allowing the country to borrow more money, we won't be able to pass a continuing resolution to keep the budget going and keeping the government open. They have until midnight Thursday, till 12:01 to resolve this, and at 12:01 Friday morning, if they haven't, we'll see the same kind of government shutdown that we did in 2018 and 2011 and in the 1990s. And I promise we'll talk about that at greater length in a more coherent way next week, but hopefully that'll do for now.
That sounds great. I think I actually remember when my mom, she was a federal employee and she had that government shutdown in the 90s. I'm sure she was terrified, but I loved having my mom home. I think she got to drive me to school, and yeah, so look for the upside of a government shutdown, right?
And one other thing to complicate this even further is because the debate over the budget and the debate over the debt limit are taking place at the same time that President Biden is running up against deadlines on his infrastructure legislation and on that reconciliation, the social spending and climate change bill. All four of them have gotten mixed together, making the situation even more complicated. But I promise that we'll do our best next week to unravel it all and turn it into something at least reasonably comprehensible.
That sounds good. Well, Dan, thank you so much. And thank you for the deep dive on immigration. We still had more questions on that, but yeah, we really appreciate it. To our audience, thanks for all of your great questions. And